How many of you here have heard of the scandal that brought down Governor Eliot Spitzer of New York and forced his resignation? Okay. Well, if you were to have been paying attention when this stuff first broke, you would have come across the name of Willie Rashbaum and his colleagues at the Times, because it was through their reporting, really, that the public became aware of what had happened with Spitzer. And as a result of that, not that that was what drove their reporting, but as a result of this becoming publicized, the governor felt he had no choice but to step down. Some of you know many of the details, some of you don't, but I think what's most interesting is to see how a story begins. And so, Willie, I'd ask you is, what was the thing that first even got you on the trail that there might be something going on here, an investigation that was reaching into the governor's office of New York State?
Well, in essence, it came out in just the course of, what we do every day. Most of the prosecutor's offices in New York send out emails announcing what they feel are their significant cases. And in this instance, the federal prosecutors in Manhattan, federal prosecutor's office in Manhattan, the Southern District, put out a press release about the arrests of 4 people in a prostitution case. And as they generally do, they issue a press release and send with it the supporting documents, the charging documents that are filed in court. And the bottom of the press release, the bottom of the press release listed, as it routinely does, the names of the prosecutors who were handling the case. And it was unusual to see, for a relatively run-of-the-mill prostitution case, the names of the head of the public corruption unit in the U.S. Attorney's Office and 2 public corruption prosecutors handling a prostitution case that normally would have really required the attention of perhaps just 1, maybe 2 much more junior prosecutors who would normally be assigned to general crimes or perhaps narcotics, if that's where the prostitution case began. So that jumped out right away, plus the FBI agent who had
Signed the
affidavit was an agent who worked on a squad at the New York FBI office that just handles public corruption cases.
Your assignment at this point is in the federal courts. You have that beat, yes?
Yeah, I actually, when this first came about, I had been covering federal court in Brooklyn. I'd been assigned to do a longer-term project and taken out of federal court and was working mostly really in the main office of the newspaper. And that project got interrupted by some other project, which was followed by some other project, and months went by, and I had not returned to my desk in federal court in Brooklyn. So I was sort of sitting in the office covering whatever my boss was interested in me covering.
Would it be fair to say that unless somebody had the experience of covering that beat, that the names of those prosecutors would not have jumped out at you, the name of that FBI agent would not have jumped out at you, and you might have just thought, well, how much interest is there in this prostitution case?
Absolutely.
Nobody really cares. It might get a blurb, might get a brief paragraph in the paper. But because you knew those names, you then said, something's going on here, something possibly extraordinary. What then became the next big step in your being able to find out what was really going on and that it actually led to the doorstep of Eliot Spitzer?
Well, there were a number of avenues that we ended up pursuing. When we initially looked at that, it was clear that there was a larger story there. Initially, we didn't know what it was, but given that it was a prostitution case, given that it was being handled by people that investigate corrupt public officials or politicians, and given what one might call a periodic or historical association between politicians and prostitution, we felt it warranted further inquiry. And so in looking down a number of different roads, in taking apart the charging documents, which there was a criminal complaint, which is essentially the charging document, but there was a much longer underlying affidavit that included a lot of details about some of the intercepted telephone calls and a lot of other things. And
there weren't any names. The name Spitzer wasn't there.
No, the name Spitzer wasn't there.
There were numbers, right?
There were
There
were clients 1 through 10, and there was a wealth of information in the affidavit that we were able to tease out into different, as I say, lines of inquiry, which, and when I say we, I think the first stories bore my byline and that of another reporter, but there were a number of people working on them and doing a lot of work. The affidavit told us that this person stayed in a hotel in Washington, D.C. on the night of February 13th, I think it was, in 2007, and stayed in room 871. And this person was recorded talking to the booker through whom he arranged to meet with a prostitute. This person was recorded telling the booker that he had booked the hotel room in his own name. So we were looking for who had stayed in room 871 at a hotel in Washington, D.C. We were not sure which hotel. And we believed that that person had stayed under their own name, or had registered under their own name.
What'd you do, start calling all the hotels in Washington?
A very enterprising reporter who used to work on the Metro desk in New York, but since transferred to the national desk and was based in Washington, managed to undertake a very exhaustive study into which hotels in Washington, D.C. actually had a room 871. Now, not every hotel has a room 871. You may have an 8th floor. You probably don't have 71 rooms on the 8th floor. And so as you go through the sort of permutations, you can see that obviously not every hotel would have a room 871.
So eventually you find out.
He was able to find which ones did, and he proceeded that weekend at night to go to these hotels and to talk to the desk clerks. And if you've ever tried to get information out of a hotel desk clerk, it's not an easy task.
As so often is the case in journalism, you have to get information from situations or people who are not very eager to give it to you. But to bring the story along faster now, you run into a name of George Fox.
That's right.
Who was George Fox?
George Fox is a political supporter and friend of the former governor. And while the room was not, as the subject of the investigation told the booker, was not registered in his own name, really, he was lying when he said that, but it was registered under Mr. Fox's name with Mr. Spitzer's address. So that sort of was certainly brought us closer to being able to put the story in the paper. The governor, he spoke briefly in front of the TV cameras and essentially acknowledged that he had gotten caught up in this case. But prior to that, we had posted the story to the web, and
that's a story that when you post it, and in prior days it would be on the wire, suddenly there are many explosions going off in news organizations everywhere, not just in New York, but nationally and so on. So it becomes a blockbuster. If we have time to take some questions, if we have anybody who'd like to ask a question of Willie? Yes, young lady over there.
What are the repercussions of a reporter fabricating an article besides a tarnished reputation or a career?
Well, the repercussions are, well, I'm not sure.
Losing your job.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether you mean the repercussions for the reporter or more broadly.
No, I'm talking about for the reporter personally. Like, I'm sure that his or her career would be tarnished, but.
Right.
But
Well,
is there
Jason
any
Blair, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I don't know if there any kind of legal responsibility or anything like that.
Well, I don't think that a reporter could be charged with a crime that I know of just for writing a story that is fabricated or false.
Unless it's defamatory. I mean,
Right. I mean, if it's libelous, but again, that wouldn't really be a crime. It would be a civil matter. But Jason Blair was a reporter at the Times who did just that and did a fair amount of it before he got caught, and he got fired, and it had a pretty serious impact on his life just because he sort of became the object of a lot of contempt and anger from people in the paper, people outside the paper. But when you first asked the question, what I was really thinking of, and what I think is sort of more important than what happens to that reporter, is that it undermines the faith of readers. And and today, the media. I mean, Shakespeare said, "Kill all the lawyers." I think the reporters are, in some ways, not far behind when you listen to the debates. I don't mean literally the debates, but when you listen to the dialogue among our presidential candidates, there are some politicians today who take advantage of the contempt that many people have for the media and use that in a sort of demagogic kind of way. And when a reporter writes a story that's false, or even when a reporter writes a story that's wrong, by mistake, which, we all do. Well, there's a correction page because everybody makes mistakes. But when you write a story about something that someone knows a lot about, and they read it, and they say, that's wrong, that undermines their faith in what they read in the newspaper. And that...
I'm sorry, wouldn't you say also, Willie, though, that the editors there bore a responsibility, that they weren't vetting his stories enough, and that they weren't asking enough critical questions about his comments or
Absolutely.
The narrative or the people he allegedly interviewed and so on?
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
My question to you, Mr. Rashbaum, is with respect to investigative journalism. In your opinion, and perhaps both of you gentlemen would be willing to answer this question, how much personal risk can a reporter expect to inherent in the course of trying to report on a particular topic or issue? For example, the late Daniel Pearl of the Wall Street Journal, rather, and Anna Politskaya of the Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta. If you could comment, please.
Anybody ever threaten you?
I think that, but it's always my editors. I think that there's really very little risk. I mean, it's a sort of romantic notion here in this country. Daniel Pearl was in a very different culture at a very volatile time. That was an exception. Russia is a very volatile place, a very different culture, a very different history with its media, with its newspapers, with its news organizations. In this country, I don't think that's an issue. If you go to many, many other countries in different parts of the world, it's a huge issue. And I don't mean if one goes, if an American reporter goes, but I mean if you look at the Sudan or places in Central America and South America, places in the Middle East where you have authoritarian regimes and you don't have a culture of a free press, it can be very dangerous for the reporters who are, who live and are from those countries. There's a couple of organizations. I think one's the Reporters Committee for Freedom, and there's the
Committee to Protect Journalists,
which really are largely focused on foreign journalists operating in their own countries overseas. Who, there's a report put out by the Committee to Protect Journalists every year, which lists journalists in different countries who are killed or abused or imprisoned. Yeah, so it's a big issue, but thankfully not really one here.
I think we are out of time. I'd hope that it was instructive and informative for you. Our thanks to Willie Rashbaum. And how about a nice round of applause? Of whom we can truly say an ace reporter.
Thank you, David.
Well done.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.